Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 in Nyíregyháza, Hungary, into one of the most powerful and influential noble families of Central Europe. The Bathory family held extensive lands, considerable wealth, and political influence in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her father, George Bathory, was a well-respected nobleman, while her mother, Anna Bathory, came from another prominent noble line, ensuring that Elizabeth was surrounded by power, wealth, and the strict expectations of aristocratic life from the very beginning. Growing up, Elizabeth received a rigorous education uncommon for women of her era. She was trained in reading, writing, religion, and household management, as well as horseback riding, hunting, and swordsmanship, skills more often reserved for young noblemen. This upbringing not only instilled a sense of privilege, but also reinforced her sense of superiority over those of lower social status. In a society defined by strict hierarchies, Elizabeth's early experiences shaped her understanding of control, power, and dominance. When she was 11 years old, Elizabeth was sent to the court of the Habsburgs, where she was exposed to the intricate politics of European nobility. This period was formative, offering her insights into manipulation, strategy, and the social games of the elite. It also introduced her to the violent and often dangerous realities of aristocratic life, where intrigue and power struggles were constant threats. These early experiences would later influence the methods and psychology behind her dark legacy. In 1573, at the age of 13, Elizabeth was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a young Hungarian nobleman with a reputation as a fierce warrior. Their marriage in 1575 was not just a union of two individuals, but a strategic alliance between two powerful families. Ferenc, often called the Black Knight of Hungary, was a man of strict discipline and military expertise. He and Elizabeth would eventually manage vast estates together, consolidating their wealth and influence. The young bride moved to Castle Csejthe, Ferenc's family stronghold, which became the backdrop for both her domestic life and the beginnings of her sinister reputation. Initially, Elizabeth's marriage was reportedly happy. She bore several children and managed her household with efficiency. However, tragedy struck early and often. Elizabeth experienced profound personal loss, including the deaths of several of her children, which historians believe may have contributed to her growing instability. These personal traumas, combined with the rigid expectations of nobility, began shaping her darker tendencies. Beyond personal tragedy, Elizabeth became increasingly involved in the political and social administration of her husband's estates, especially during Ferenc's extended absences on military campaigns. She exercised near absolute control over the lands, the peasants, and the servants, establishing herself as a formidable presence. Accounts suggest that she was exacting and often cruel toward those under her authority, a personality trait that would later manifest in far more extreme forms. Historians note that Elizabeth was known for her striking beauty, intelligence, and charm. She was able to attract attention and admiration from her peers, and she leveraged this social influence to consolidate her power. Yet, beneath this outward appearance of nobility and grace whispers of cruelty began circulating. Early reports suggest that she derived a disturbing sense of control over those weaker than herself, an inclination that would escalate in later years. The culture of the time also played a role in shaping Elizabeth's actions. The late 16th century in Hungary was marked by political instability, fear of invasion by the Ottoman Empire, and a rigid feudal system that allowed nobles to exert nearly unchecked authority over their subjects. Within this context, extreme acts of cruelty could be both concealed and excused, as the lives of peasants and servants were considered far less valuable than those of the elite. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth's reputation among her household and local community was beginning to darken. Servants and young girls who worked closely with her began disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts suggest that Elizabeth claimed these actions were part of discipline or punishment, while others hint at the beginnings of her notorious obsession with blood and youth, a fascination that would later define her legacy as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Bathory's ornate life and the rise as a powerful noblewoman set the stage on the horrifying events to come. Her noble birth provided her with wealth, influence, and social immunity, while her personal tragedies and exposure to a harsh, hierarchical society may have contributed to the psychological factors underlying her later crimes. The next chapter will explore how Elizabeth's descent into violence and murder began, examining the first recorded incidents that would eventually lead to her notorious status as one of history's most infamous female killers. By the 1590s, Elizabeth Bathory's reputation had taken a darker turn. Castle Csejthe, her family's stronghold, became the center of stories whispered in fear across the surrounding villages. Elizabeth, once admired for her beauty and intellect, was increasingly feared for her cruelty. Reports suggest that her obsession with youth, beauty, and control over others began to dominate her life, laying the groundwork for the series of atrocities that would later define her as the Blood Countess. The earliest documented victims were often young servant girls, orphaned or poor, who had no family to protect them. Elizabeth's position of power allowed her to summon these girls to her household under the guise of employment, apprenticeship, or service. Once inside her domain, they were subjected to strict discipline, harsh treatment, and, in many cases, torture. Chronicles describe how some girls disappeared without explanation, never to be seen again, raising suspicion among locals, but remaining largely unchecked due to Elizabeth's noble status. One of the most disturbing aspects of Elizabeth Bathory's alleged crimes was her obsession with blood. Accounts from the 1610s, when she was finally tried, claim that she believed bathing in the blood of young girls would preserve her youth and beauty. While some historians debate the extent of these claims, contemporary reports and testimonies depict a chilling pattern. Girls were beaten, starved, and tortured before being killed, often in Elizabeth's private chambers or hidden parts of the castle. Blood was collected in basins, and some stories suggest that she bathed in it, convinced it would halt the effects of aging. whether entirely true or exaggerated by later chroniclers. These stories cemented her image as a bloodthirsty, almost supernatural figure. Elizabeth's methods of murder were both calculated and sadistic. Testimonies from her trial describe a variety of tactics. Girls were physically beaten, forced to endure starvation, burned with hot irons, or scalded with water. Some were hanged, and others reportedly drowned. The sheer brutality of these acts, combined with the prolonged suffering of the victims, paints a picture of a woman who derived pleasure and power from the pain of others. Her servants were often complicit, either through fear, coercion, or reward, assisting her in these crimes or helping to conceal evidence. The scale of Elizabeth Bathory's alleged crimes is staggering. Historical sources claim she may have murdered over 600 girls, though some estimates are lower, around 80 to 200 confirmed victims. What is clear, however, is that her reputation for cruelty was widespread and enduring. Reports indicate that neighboring nobles, clergy, and peasants began to speak of disappearances, strange screams at night, and the eerie presence of a dark, controlling figure at Castle Csejthe. Despite the rumors, the Bathory family's influence initially shielded Elizabeth from legal scrutiny, allowing her to continue her activities for years without interference. Her husband, King Matthias II, often away at war, was reportedly aware of some abuses, but either dismissed them or tolerated them, as his attention was primarily directed toward military campaigns and political alliances. Some historians suggest that Ferenc may have shared in the cruelty, though evidence is limited. After his death in 1604, Elizabeth's behavior reportedly intensified. Without her husband's oversight, she exercised total control over the estate and the people within it, further escalating the scale and audacity of her crimes. Stories of her cruelty began to reach higher authorities. Locals eventually approached the King of Hungary, complaining about the disappearances and brutal treatment of girls on Elizabeth's estate. In 1610, King Matthias II authorized an investigation, sending trusted officials to gather evidence. They discovered shocking conditions, hidden rooms, tortured servants, and witnesses who testified to the systematic abuse and murder of young girls. These testimonies, collected under duress and oath, painted a horrifying picture of Elizabeth's obsession with blood and domination. The investigation revealed more than just physical cruelty. Elizabeth's psychological manipulation was equally disturbing. Girls were often isolated, threatened, and forced to witness the suffering of others as a method of control. Fear permeated the castle. Servants were terrified of crossing Elizabeth, knowing that even minor disobedience could result in brutal punishment or death. She created an atmosphere of terror that allowed her to operate with near total impunity, maintaining dominance over her household and reinforcing her image as an untouchable aristocrat. By the time the authorities concluded their investigation, Elizabeth Bathory's crimes were undeniable. The evidence collected, testimonies of torture, witness accounts of disappearances, and documentation of her sadistic behavior, presented a chilling record of prolonged and deliberate violence. Her name became synonymous with terror, cruelty, and obsession with youth, earning her the infamous title, the Blood Countess. The legacy of Elizabeth Bathory's crimes extended far beyond her immediate victims. Her story spread across Europe, inspiring fear, fascination, and countless legends. Folktales exaggerated her obsession with blood, often portraying her as a vampiric figure capable of supernatural acts, while modern historians debate the accuracy of these accounts. The sheer volume of testimony and corroborating evidence confirms that her cruelty was real, deliberate, and devastating to countless young lives. By the end of the 16th century, Elizabeth Bathory had transformed from a respected noblewoman into one of history's most notorious female murderers. Her obsession with youth, her sadistic methods, and the sheer scale of her crimes mark her as a uniquely terrifying figure. The next chapter will examine her arrest, trial, and eventual imprisonment, revealing how the law and social hierarchy intersected to bring one of history's most feared women to justice. By 1610, Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror could no longer remain hidden. The cumulative rumors, complaints from local villagers, and the testimonies of surviving servants forced the hand of Hungarian authorities. King Matthias II, concerned with both justice and maintaining order among the nobility, commissioned a formal investigation into her activities. This marked the beginning of the end for the woman who had ruled Castle Csejthe with fear and absolute authority. The investigation was led by Georgi Thurzo, a trusted nobleman tasked with compiling evidence against Elizabeth. Thurzo's mission was delicate. Elizabeth Bathory was a powerful aristocrat with vast influence, and direct accusations against her carried significant political risk. To gather information, investigators relied heavily on eyewitness testimonies from servants, family members, and villagers who had witnessed unusual disappearances or endured abuse themselves. Many witnesses were terrified to speak, fearing retribution. But a combination of threats and promises of protection convinced them to testify. Accounts collected during the investigation were horrific. Witnesses described girls being lured to the castle under the pretense of employment, then subjected to prolonged torture, beatings, starvation, and humiliation. Some claimed to have seen Elizabeth intentionally harm her victims, collecting their blood in basins for bathing or ritualistic purposes. While some historians debate the veracity of the blood bathing claims, they were widely circulated and became a central part of the charges against her. Other allegations detailed psychological torment, with young girls forced to witness the suffering of others and live under constant fear. Ferenc Nadasdy, Elizabeth's husband, had died in 1604, leaving her in complete control of the estate. His absence allowed her to continue her abuses without oversight, and his death may have accelerated the escalation of her cruelty. Local authorities reported that villagers were living in terror, fearing that their daughters or relatives could vanish into the hands of the Blood Countess. The growing unease could no longer be ignored, and by December 1610, King Matthias ordered Elizabeth's arrest. The arrest of Elizabeth Bathory was dramatic. Because of her noble status, she could not be tried in a standard court. Instead, special legal procedures were enacted, and she was effectively placed under house arrest in her own castle. Thurzo and other officials, fearing a violent backlash, did not confront her directly with formal accusations at first. Instead, they secured the cooperation of her family and key witnesses to ensure her confinement was achievable without public unrest. Once the legal process began, Elizabeth was confronted with evidence of her crimes, including detailed testimonies from survivors who had endured her torture. During the proceedings, Elizabeth reportedly refused to admit guilt, asserting her innocence and denying many of the allegations. Some witnesses described her as defiant, others as unnervingly calm, demonstrating her arrogance and sense of entitlement. Because of her aristocratic status, a full public trial was never held. Instead, the authorities used a combination of confessions from her accomplices and sworn testimonies from victims to establish a legal case. The evidence was overwhelming, a consistent pattern of abuse, credible witness accounts, and her own history of violence made it impossible for officials to dismiss the charges. Elizabeth Bathory was never formally sentenced to death. Executing a noblewoman of her status could have caused political instability, so authorities opted for a more constrained punishment. In 1611, she was imprisoned in a small, windowless room in Csejthe Castle, effectively under house arrest until her death. The room was sparsely furnished, and she was allowed minimal contact with the outside world. Some reports suggest that her confinement was strict, with guards ensuring she could not communicate freely or continue her abuses. For the remainder of her life, she lived in near total isolation, a shadow of the woman who had once commanded power and terror over hundreds. Elizabeth's accomplices, servants and officials who had assisted or ignored her crimes, were punished more severely. Several were executed, while others were imprisoned for their roles in the systematic torture and murder of young girls. These measures served both as retribution and as a warning to other nobles who might exploit their positions to commit crimes with impunity. The legal response was unprecedented, highlighting the authorities' determination to hold even the most powerful figures accountable for heinous acts. Elizabeth Bathory remained imprisoned for 3 years, dying in 1614 at the age of 54. She spent her final years confined, reflecting perhaps on the empire of fear she had once commanded. While historians debate whether she fully understood the magnitude of her actions or simply sought to maintain her sense of power until the very end, the consequences of her crimes were undeniable. Her death did not erase the trauma inflicted on her victims or the mark she left on European history as one of the most notorious female killers of all time. The story of Elizabeth Bathory's arrest, trial, and imprisonment also illustrates broader themes of power, privilege, and justice in 17th century Europe. Her noble status initially protected her, allowing years of unchecked cruelty, but ultimately, even a countess could not escape legal and social consequences. The case demonstrates how fear, wealth, and influence can shield perpetrators, yet systematic investigation and collective courage of victims, witnesses, and authorities can eventually restore justice, even if delayed. Elizabeth Bathory's imprisonment was both punishment and containment. She would never again roam the halls of her castle freely or wield her power over others. Yet, her legend had already begun to spread beyond Hungary, fueled by stories of her cruelty, her obsession with blood, and her terrifying methods. This legend would evolve over centuries, inspiring tales of vampirism, horror, and moral caution, influencing literature and folklore across Europe. The next chapter will explore Elizabeth Bathory's legacy, examining how her crimes were remembered, mythologized, and interpreted through history. It will also consider the historical debate over the accuracy of the blood bathing legend and how the story of the Blood Countess continues to captivate the imagination of scholars, writers, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Elizabeth Bathory died in 1614, imprisoned within the cold, dark walls of Castle Csejthe, yet her story did not end with her death. Over the centuries, she became one of the most infamous figures in European history, earning the enduring moniker, the Blood Countess. Her legacy is a complex combination of historical fact, folklore, and sensationalized accounts, blending verified events with myth, legend, and cultural imagination. Understanding Elizabeth Bathory's legacy requires examining both the reality of her crimes and the ways in which history and storytelling have magnified her infamy. Immediately following her death, chroniclers recorded the extraordinary cruelty she had allegedly inflicted upon young girls. Tales of her bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth and beauty quickly circulated, even though contemporary evidence for this practice is limited and debated by historians. Some argue that these stories were exaggerated by political enemies or later storytellers seeking sensational material. Others contend that the extreme reports, while perhaps embellished, were rooted in actual acts of torture and murder. Regardless, these legends cemented her reputation as a figure of almost supernatural evil. Elizabeth Bathory's case is often cited as the first recorded example of a female serial killer operating on such a large scale. Her crimes challenge contemporary perceptions of gender and violence. The notion that a woman could systematically torture and kill hundreds of victims was both horrifying and fascinating to European society. This contributed to the creation of a macabre narrative around her life, blending fear, moral caution, and fascination with aristocratic excess. She became a symbol of how unchecked power, wealth, and privilege can facilitate atrocities, particularly when social hierarchies place the vulnerable at the mercy of the elite. Over the centuries, Elizabeth Bathory became a prominent figure in literature, folklore, and popular culture. Writers and storytellers drew upon her story to craft Gothic tales of horror, vampirism, and dark obsession. Legends of a blood-drinking countess influenced the development of vampire mythology in Europe, and some modern scholars suggest that her life may have partially inspired fictional characters like Bram Stoker's Count, Dracula, or other literary figures associated with immortality through blood. This intersection of historical crime and myth underscores the enduring fascination with her persona. historical scholarship has also attempted to separate fact from fiction. Modern historians examine court documents, testimonies, and contemporary chronicles to assess the reality of Elizabeth's actions. While the exact number of victims remains uncertain, records confirm multiple instances of torture, murder, and abuse, establishing that her cruelty was genuine. At the same time, some researchers argue that political motives, inheritance disputes, and social rivalries may have contributed to the severity of accusations against her. In an era when noble families wielded immense influence, exaggerating crimes could serve as a tool to diminish an opponent's power. Elizabeth's cultural legacy extends into contemporary media as well. She has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films exploring her life, crimes, and psychological motivations. True crime enthusiasts continue to debate her methods, her obsession with blood, and the psychological factors underlying her behavior. Psychologists and criminologists analyze her case to understand the intersection of trauma, power, and sadistic behavior, while historians contextualize her within the social, political, and gendered structures of 16th and 17th century Hungary. This dual approach, scientific and historical, allows modern audiences to appreciate both the horror of her crimes and the complexity of her character. The story of Elizabeth Bathory also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. Her noble birth and vast wealth initially allowed her to operate without oversight, illustrating how social and political privilege can shield perpetrators from accountability. Yet, her eventual arrest, confinement, and punishment demonstrate that even the most powerful individuals can face consequences when collective action and legal authority intervene. Her life underscores the moral that extreme cruelty, no matter how long concealed, will ultimately attract justice. Despite her horrific acts, Elizabeth Bathory's legend has endured not just for its horror, but for its ability to evoke deep fascination with human psychology and the dark side of aristocratic privilege. She embodies the interplay of fact and folklore, reality and myth, and her story continues to captivate historians, writers, and audiences around the world. The Blood Countess remains a stark reminder of the potential for evil inherent in unchecked power, as well as the ways in which history and legend can intertwine to create figures that endure far beyond their lifetimes. Even today, Castle Csejthe, or what remains of it, draws visitors and historians alike, eager to explore the place where Elizabeth Bathory exercised control and committed her infamous acts. Exhibitions, documentaries, and cultural references keep her memory alive, blending historical inquiry with fascination for the macabre. Her life and crimes serve as both a historical lesson and a chilling story of obsession, cruelty, and the human capacity for violence. In the final analysis, Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is a mosaic of fact, rumor, and myth. She was a real woman who committed heinous acts. Yet the stories that surround her have elevated her into a symbol of horror transcending history. From her early life as a noblewoman to her years of imprisonment, and finally into legend, Elizabeth Bathory's story is one of power, obsession, cruelty, and enduring fascination. Her tale is a testament to the darkest corners of human ambition and the ways history can immortalize both deeds and myths, leaving a chilling imprint on culture and collective memory.